We resume our studies of Mark's Gospel today at the beginning of chapter 3, where Mark tells us, "Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked round at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." When Bibles were first printed, the editors divided the various books in the Bible up into chapters and verses. This was done to help us find passages more quickly, and it's invaluable, as every student of the Scriptures knows. However, sometimes this proves to be a disservice, and that's true here. In fact, today's reading concludes the section of Mark's account of Jesus' life, which began at chapter 2, verse 1, and which describes 5 different incidents in Jesus' early ministry. The present passage, therefore, being the last. The first story we've already seen records Jesus' healing of the paralysed man, and tells us that Jesus claimed on that occasion to be able to forgive sins against God. The religious leaders of the day recognised this claim as blasphemy, which it was, unless, of course, it was true. In the following 3 stories, though Jesus is cautious in the way he advances his claims, he continues to make statements that indicate his self-belief that he is the promised Messiah. However, the religious leaders show little interest in giving Jesus the benefit of the doubt, and by the present section, Jesus is guilty until proven guilty and facing the death penalty. Mark simply tells us that the present incident occurred at another time, so we don't know when this incident actually took place. However, it seems clear that Mark himself wishes to include this story here to demonstrate the way in which people then and now refuse to give Jesus a proper hearing. Mark is therefore gently challenging us to avoid making the same mistake. And he has, of course, a lot more evidence to offer us as to who Jesus is, 14 more chapters of evidence, in fact. I suppose he might therefore be saying to us, are you ready to hear me? And above all, to hear Jesus out? But I think that Mark's first point here is that all too often it's our stubbornness that means that we fail to give Jesus the proper hearing that he deserves. Now, the scribes of the Pharisees were the religious and intellectual leaders of Jesus' day. Initially, they showed a passing interest in Jesus and his ministry. However, when they heard his claim to be able to forgive sin, they immediately took a false turn. If what Jesus was saying was a lie, they were correct to say his words were blasphemy, as we've already noted. But there was another possibility, however unlikely at the time, that he was telling the truth. And they were never ready to accept that possibility. So Jesus' other claims or invitations to further reflection fell on deaf ears. Mark does not explore in depth the reasons why these people reacted as they did. He leaves this to our imaginations. However, Jesus identifies it as the stubbornness of their heart. And as Jesus' ministry unfolds, it becomes clearer and clearer that the problem was indeed not intellectual, but moral. A good case can, after all, be made for Jesus' claims, as Mark is demonstrating. However, self-interest, pride, Reluctance to face up to the challenges that Jesus brings can so often then and today lead to closed minds. So Mark highlights here a fundamental problem. He's showing that to believe the claims Jesus made is, in his view, as an eyewitness, reasonable. However, reasonable people seem to abandon reason when brought face to face with Jesus. The problem is then that at the heart of humankind is a bias which has closed minds, hearts and wills to receiving the truth. Men and women are stubborn and blind until God's Spirit opens their eyes. So Mark's story throws out a challenge. Will you and I ask God to restore our ability to see clearly? There is nevertheless something rather absurd about refusing to think through Jesus' claims about himself. That's very clear here. Indeed, the story here is a sort of black comedy. Looking to find reason to accuse Jesus, his opponents anxiously watched to see if Jesus would heal on the Sabbath. The point is, of course, that in their tortured minds, healing is to work and work is forbidden on the Sabbath. They've learned nothing from their previous encounter with Jesus, and Jesus' question reveals the absurdity of it all. Effectively, he says, you want to trap me if I perform one of the very signs that show who I am? Implicitly then he says, I'm ready to do good, but you're planning evil. So good has become evil and evil good in your own understanding. And Mark's point is therefore that when a mind has become so warped, truth never has a chance. Truly there are none so blind as those who cannot see. It remains true today that clever and not so clever men and women clothe their reluctance to face up to Jesus in the reasoning of which, please excuse my language, brute beasts would be ashamed. As the centuries have passed, time and again such absurdity is exposed, and the arguments used to refuse to consider Jesus and his claims have fallen to the ground in ruins. Yet there always seems an ever more absurd reason which convinces people in their blindness to reject Jesus. Again, at this early stage of his gospel, I think that Mark is challenging us. It may be, he says, that the problem we perceive with Jesus and his claims are not that the claims are impossible, but that we're simply not prepared to give him a hearing. And Mark is also inviting us to reflect upon the nature of our arguments. Are they as absurd as we believe Jesus' claims to be? Last of all, this passage reveals to us something of the tragedy of unbelief. There's something profoundly sad about the last verse. Intellectually countered by Jesus and faced with the incontrovertible evidence of a miracle conducted before them while seated in the front row of all places, implacable enemies found common cause to plan to remove Jesus from the scene. Now the context is this: the scribes of the Pharisees were, as we've already seen, the religious elite of Jesus' day. They were also proudly nationalistic and longed for the Jewish people to be freed from the imperial power of Rome. The Herodians were of a very different mindset. They were the political elite who'd gained and sustained power by being willing to compromise with that very occupying power. Their interest in religion extended only to using it as a means to retain their authority in the nation. Understandably, these two groups were as different from one another as they could possibly be, and they were implacable enemies. They could agree on nothing. But here, they find a common cause in opposing Jesus. No wonder Jesus showed a mixture of grief and anger. Mark's point is that faced with Jesus and his claims, all sorts of people can find a common cause in opposing him, and for the same sort of reasons that we identified a few minutes ago. And while times may change, the common hostility to the Christian message seems to remain. Strange bedfellows are found united in common cause against Jesus. We learn from this that we should not be surprised when we witness such disunited opposition to Jesus. Arguably greater is the world's shared hostility to Jesus than the greatest divisions of humankind. And if this is so, we need to recognize this for what it is: a reluctance, even a refusal to consider Jesus and his claims, appears to be rooted in corrupt motives of our hearts and the blindness of our minds. Again, the problem appears to not be an intellectual but a moral one. Could that be said to be true of me or of you? Mark is a very skilled writer, and just at this point in his story, he records for us this incident. It is effectively what we sometimes call a health warning. Mark is insistent that his extraordinary claims about Jesus and Jesus' own claims about himself are not actually unreasonable. The quality of the arguments Jesus made and the evidence he offered of their being true were demonstrated through his miracles. And these were incidents that Mark and those who told him about them had actually witnessed. The evidence was not lacking to offer those around Jesus and we ourselves a reasonable basis for belief. We're not called to some sort of absurd, unreasonable leap into the dark. In fact, Mark implies, it's unbelief that stubbornly refuses to face facts, absurdly snatches at the most unlikely straws, and tragically, in wicked communion then and now, faces Jesus' anger and his deep sadness.